I mean, how many people believe that whoever is elected president of the United States will save the world economy? I mean, do you think Hillary can save it? Donald can save it? You know, and what happens if the giant crash does come? You know, what can you do to prevent that? So today, as you know, at myself personally, you know, what financial education includes, you should make money when markets are going up, and you should make more money when markets are coming down. And today we're going to be talking about why the markets are coming down, global markets, but also what you can do to prosper from a global crash. Any comments, Kim?
Well, we've got some very, very special guests today, and it really is going to be a big overview on the economy, what's happening, the stock market, with oil, all of the things that are near and dear to your heart. And we also have an expert on water, because water we're seeing is going to be a huge issue in the very near future. California is already telling you it's already an issue today. So, we've got some fantastic guests, and we're going to have a full-packed show.
So our first special guest today is Chris Martenson. He's always a welcome member to our program because, unlike myself, he is an academic scholar. He's a PhD in toxicology, but he realized one day that Wall Street was not telling him the truth, and buying and holding for the long term was not going to buy him the financial security for he and his family. So with that, Chris went and did his own research, being a PhD in research, and he wrote a book called The Crash Course. And when I read that book, I love the guy. You know, as we say at Rich Dad, the definition of intelligence is if you agree with me, you're intelligent. So Chris is a very intelligent guy. We've traveled the world together. We've been in South America and all this, talking to people about how do you prepare for the coming crash, because this is a global process. This is not just about the U.S., and the thing that I love about Chris, he's talking about how fast the crash will come. So once again, welcome to the program, Chris.
Robert, Kim, it's a real pleasure to be back with you both.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
So let me ask you this question. You know, Janet Yellen's threatening to raise, a quarter point or whatever they do. But, will that stop and save the global economy from a crash?
No, it's far too late. We're way over the tips of our skis on this one. Look, I've always diagnosed our original problems were based on just three simple words: too much debt. We had too much debt in 2008, and if you didn't like how much debt we had then, you're going to hate where we are today. The world has $57 trillion additional dollars of debt since 2008, courtesy of central banks printing like crazy, governments borrowing like crazy, all with this one hope, and one hope only: we're going to get back to fast economic growth worldwide. Hasn't happened. Only this time we're going to enter this next crisis with more debt. Whether they raise rates a half a quarter of a point or a full quarter point, totally immaterial. Changes nothing.
Well, the New York Times this last weekend had a great article about the Fed chairman back in the crash of 29, and then they had a comparison between Ben Bernanke and the crash of 2007. And they said, unfortunately, Ben Bernanke may be a student of the last crash that brought us the Great Depression in 1929. But he says Ben Bernanke hasn't learned anything. I mean, maybe a very smart man, but he's not done anything to prevent the next crash. Would you kind of agree with that?
I would agree, because the things that were really the cause of the last crash, people like to say, oh, it was the housing bubble. That was just a piece of it. What was really happening was we had banks that were too big, running extremely risky strategies that were almost destined to fail. We had way too much debt in the system overall at the sovereign level, not just households. And so cast forward to today, what do we have? Well, banks that are even much bigger than they used to be before, much more concentrated, running increasingly risky strategies. There are more derivatives in the financial system, not fewer. And governments have borrowed a lot more than they had on the books back then.
So what's the bad news?
Well, let me ask you this, Chris. We hear all the time, all the financial networks and all the financial papers and magazines, all about growth. They all talk about growth. Here's growth this, growth that. You say fast growth won't happen. Why? Why is that not going to happen?
Well, it's not going to happen for a couple of reasons. One is, a lot of the growth in the world happened because of China. And what did China do when they grew? Well, they built things. They built ghost cities. They built infrastructure. They put in high-speed trains. There's only so far a country can go with those sorts of build-out programs. China's hit the wall. And it's not insignificant. China's responsible for half the world's cement consumption, half the world's steel consumption, and a variety of other things like copper and tin and all that. So China's growth story is over. They just can't grow anymore because they've already been through that part of the cycle, and so we're just going to see slow global growth.
So let me ask you this, but you started your own personal research a while ago. Would you mind giving us a quick synopsis of when you kind of woke up from the dream that growth would go on forever and you had a safe and your retirement was secure? When did you kind of wake up? What happened?
Yeah, that was 2001. Of course, the stock market burst in March of 2000, and it took me a full year to realize that it wasn't coming back, and I believed my broker that, stocks would come back. And that was when I first started researching what was going on in the economy. What I found there scared me. I discovered things like reading Creature from Jekyll Island, how money is created. I hadn't learned that somehow. I learned about underfunded entitlement programs, debt levels, all very quaint by today's numbers, but they scared me then. And then I started to connect some other things to this story, and I understood that it's the resources that actually drive the economy, not the other way around. Either you have energy, you have copper, you have lumber, or you don't. So those are the real resources, and that's where the story got very concerning to me, because I was seeing that we humans were up against a limit of how much new stuff we could get out of the ground. And most importantly, Robert and Kim, the stuff we were getting out of the ground was costing more and more and more because it was deeper, more dilute, harder to get. It's hard to grow when you're pulling oil up from 10,000 feet down instead of just 1,000 feet down.
Right, but let me ask this question. What were you doing at the time? Give us a little bit of your background. What are you a PhD in? And you had a great career, vice president of a Fortune 500 company, or you had all the things going for you. A lot of people bought into the dream. I always talk about if you go to school, you get a great job, make a lot of money, and then you retire into Happy Land. But what were you doing when you realized Happy Land didn't exist anymore?
That's a great question because it was a pretty rude wake-up for me. I'd done everything I was supposed to do. I was winning by my society standards, went to school, got advanced degrees, ended up being vice president of a company called SAIC, very large company. And when I finally woke up, I realized that I had put all of this effort into saving and earning and investing, air quotes on that, investing, and it all just evaporated. Like half my portfolio went away in that first rundown. How is it that half my wealth, half my life's effort just vanished? That was my wake-up call, and that was where it took me a while to figure it out, but eventually I figured out that I was the sucker in this story. They tell you if you spend a half hour at a card table in Texas and you don't know who the sucker is, it's you.
Once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking to Dr. Chris Martenson. He's the author of a fabulous book called Crash Course, and the positioning statement is the unsustainable future of our economy, energy, and environment. And today we're talking about what you can do, but, Chris said a magic word in there. One word is called resources. And for those of you who follow the Rich Dad mantra, in the asset column of all rich people, number one is a business. They're entrepreneurs, guys like Bill Gates or Henry Ford or Walt Disney. Second is real estate. And Kim and I love real estate for one reason, debt. And Chris talks about how debt is bad, but there's also good debt if you can use debt to acquire and know how to manage debt. The third, which most people are in, are paper assets, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and things like this. And the fourth category is a category Kim and I are also in. It's called commodities. And Kim and I are very heavily invested in oil and gas. And we took two companies public, one in South America for silver and one in China for gold. But we found out the hard way, it's not good to do business with China.
Well, that's interesting. You talk about China, and Chris, you talked about when China was booming. And, a lot of people, if they were building a home about 10 years ago, because, Robert, you and I were looking at building an apartment building, and we decided not to do it because all of the resources, cement, building materials, lumber, PVC, everything was so damn expensive because it was all going to China, right? And so you're saying now that China's slowing down, all world growth is slowing down. So what do we do?
Well, I think it's time to buckle up. And I believe that we're in for a really rocky period, which is what we've been predicting for a while at Peak Prosperity, is this idea that when the growth is over, your authorities, the central bankers, right, Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke, their equivalents in other countries, they don't know what to do, so they just keep throwing money at it. And
you're telling us they don't know what they're doing?
I'm telling you, they don't know what they're doing.
Oh, my God, that's news here.
And part of it is it's like they're playing pool, but all they can see is the cue ball. They can't see any of the other balls on the table. They're not aware of resources. They're not really aware of the historical, rationale for what debt does. They're not aware of oil. They're not aware of those things, really. They don't know them. You saw Ben Bernanke in 2007 saying, "Oh, the housing crisis will be contained." He wasn't aware that there were hairdressers in Las Vegas buying 19 homes. He just wasn't. He didn't know what was happening.
God bless those guys. God bless them. Hey, once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking to a friend. We've traveled the world together, Dr. Chris Martenson. We've been talking about the coming crash, and Chris is going to, when he comes back, we're going to be talking about how fast that crash will hit us. It's not about what is going to happen, but how fast it's going to happen. In the second part, and then we're going to be talking about one of the most precious commodities of all that nobody ever talks about. It's a commodity called water. And Kim and I were just in California a couple of days ago.
Oh, it's a sad sight. Driving down the freeway, you see all these beautiful old trees just dying everywhere.
And worse than that is there's parts that we went to where the land was 10 feet taller. In other words, we were standing 10 feet below where the land used to be 10 years ago. And the reason for the drop in the height of land is because California has been sucking out its groundwater, and now they're out of groundwater also and no rainwater. And so they always don't where the rain is coming, but I'm afraid they're in la-la land. So
and on top of it, it's only about 3% of the water that's used is for consumption. The rest is for agriculture. So that affects our food and how much food we're going to get out there, too. Yeah, it affects everything.
So once again, all of our programs are archived at richdadradio.com. Our first guest today was an old-time friend of ours, Chris Martenson. He's an economic researcher and futurist specializing in energy and resource depletion and co-founder of peakprosperity.com. He's the author of a fabulous book. I recommend everybody read it. It's called The Crash Course, The Unsustainable Future of Our Economy, Energy, and Environment. Our second guest today is Scott Rickards. He is president and CEO and founder of Waterfund, LLC. Waterfunds develops financial risk management products for the water industry and is best known for his partnership with IBM to create a global water cost index. And his website is worldswaterfund.com. And Chris, would you mind telling, because we're talking about water now, which is a resource much like gold, oil, silver. But you have an idea. This is, when I read Crash Course, this is what really kind of opened my eyes, is how fast the crash will come and why 99% of the people will not see it hit them. Could you use the analogy or the metaphor of sitting in like the Yankee Stadium with one drop of water being dropped in every second?
Yeah, so brings up a really important point, which is that the reason most people aren't going to be able to see what's coming is because what's coming is going to come at us exponentially quickly. Exponentially just means it's a function. It happens faster and faster, and we're surrounded by it. And so here's an example to help people understand it, because it's not intuitive. We're humans. Exponential stuff is math geek. But here's how it works. Imagine that we have this magic eyedropper, and what's magic is that we drop a drop of water out, and every minute that drop of water is going to double. So after 1 minute, you have 2 drops, and after 2 minutes, you have 4 drops. And after 5 minutes, you can fill up a thimble, right, because this water is doubling every minute. So here's the experiment. We're going to go somewhere. We're going to ruin a stadium. I like to pick Yankee Stadium. I'm from Massachusetts. This just happened.
The Red Sox don't care for the Yankees, for those who may not know the rivalry.
It's a little intense. But so we're going to make this park watertight, and we're going to handcuff you to the highest row of bleacher seats. And so here's the question. It's 12 o'clock tomorrow. We put one of these magic drops on the pitcher's mound, and it starts to double. And the question is, how long do you have to escape from your handcuffs. Now, when I ask this question in audiences, people will say things like, oh, I got a month, I got 3 weeks, I've got a couple of days. And a few people get it right. The answer is you only have 50 minutes to escape from those handcuffs. In 50 minutes, that park is 100% full. And here's the important part. 45 minutes into this story, that park is still 97% empty space.
Wait, say that again? Say that again? The first what? The next?
In the first 45 minutes. So you're sitting there, you're eating hot dogs, 45 minutes have passed, and there's maybe 3 feet of water on the infield, and then 5 more minutes, and the whole thing is full, and hopefully you got out of your handcuffs.
So that's what really terrified me when I read your book about 2 or 3 years ago, is I ran off and got prepared. Right, Kim?
Yes, we did. We did a lot of things, and I went on your book has made a total difference in our life and how we've prepared. We've got food, we've got water, we've got we have a house on a river. We got it all.
And we got the 4 most precious metals.
Yes, we do.
The 4 most precious metals are gold, silver, guns, and bullets.
So, Chris,
we're ready.
This is a great example because you say it's coming so fast, because the 2008 crash seemed to come pretty fast. People go, oh, I didn't see that coming. Oh, my God, there goes the housing market. I didn't see that coming. You're saying it's going to happen a lot faster than 2008.
It is, and if you know where to look, you can see the signs of the next crash coming.
Where do you look?
I see it all the time.
Where do you look?
Well, they start from the outside in, so you look at the edges of things, right? So look at what's happening right now with the currencies in Brazil, Malaysia, Indonesia,
Russia,
South Africa, Russia, Ukraine, all of these places which are weaker emerging economies, and they're just being crushed at this point in time. If you want to look in the credit markets, you don't look at treasury notes, you look at junk debt, right? We're seeing stress there already. So you look at the edges, and that tells you with a good amount of warning that something's coming. And I'll tell you right now, the warning signs are all flashing bright red on the outside. Maybe they get this under control for a little longer, but right now there's enough that a prudent person would say, maybe I should have that house on a stream.
So once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. We have 2 guests today, Dr. Chris Martenson, but also Scott Rickards. And like I said, he's the president and CEO, the founder of Waterfront LLC. And the reason it's related is because after listening to Chris, Kim and I live in the desert, Arizona. Water is very valuable. And so after listening to Chris, we moved up into the mountains of Arizona, and we bought a house on a stream. But more important than the stream, the house and the property came with a thing called water rights. And it was grandfathered in by a man named Grover Cleveland, President of the United States. So Kim and I are happy. We're taking Chris's advice. We have the thing on the property. And guess what? One day we come up there and we find our neighbor stealing our water. The guy's with a ditch witch or a backhoe, and he's trenching along the place to put in a pipe to steal our water. And as they say in Arizona, whiskey is for sipping and water is for fighting. 5 families are stealing our water. And with that introduction, I'll bring Scott Rickards in. Scott's father is another man I look up to, Jim Rickards. His book is called Currency Wars. And Scott very wisely went into water. So, Scott, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be on. And I have to say, you're unusual, both of you, Kim and Robert, in that you've acquired water. That's something most people haven't thought about doing, much less going ahead and having the foresight to buy a property in a very dry state that has water on it. So that's unusual. And then you're unusual in the sense that you're actually going through the complicated process of litigating water rights, which in the United States is very complicated. Depends on which state you're in. We have a different legal system depending on where you are. California is completely different from Texas. Texas is different from Arizona. So you've entered the quagmire of litigating water rights, which I don't. I have to say I don't envy that process, but that's what owning water is like in the U.S. today, unfortunately.
Scott, for those listening, would you explain what water rights are and why they're so important today?
Right. So what a water right gives you, and again, it differs state by state, but if you own a piece of property, for example, in Texas, as we all know, you own everything underneath it. That can differ in a place like Colorado, where if you're a newcomer, you're last in line for water, even if you're sitting right there on the Colorado River. So it really differs place to place. In most countries around the world, that's not even an option. If you are a private property owner, the government still owns and has a right to all of that water. So what we've done is try to basically ignore the complexities of the water rights themselves, because they're so different, and we've gone ahead and tried to figure out what it's worth. And that's been my company and my approach to water, is to really put a value on it, and then have an intelligent conversation about how to allocate it.
So Waterfront LLC, you see water as an investment opportunity.
It's a huge investment opportunity, but unfortunately it's misunderstood. I mean, water is one of the most intuitive resources out there. It's the most intuitive resource we have. Everyone uses it and understands it, but for some reason, no one's been able to put a value on it. We all buy bottled water, and we know that's too expensive, and we also all use tap water. I think most of us know that's too cheap based on what we pay in our water bills. So there's a huge difference in those two water products, and it's effectively the same thing. Both are fresh water. Why are they priced so differently? And the answer is, government more or less controls the game in terms of allocating water resources and pricing them. So the investment opportunities are few and far between, and that's why you see people generally struggling with water investments and trying to figure out how to get into that kind of asset allocation.
So wouldn't you say that water today is more expensive than oil per barrel?
Well, it depends on where you are.
Right, but bottled water I'm talking about.
Oh, sure, yeah, of course. Bottled water, far and away more expensive than oil, and that's what most of us are going around drinking.
Chris, what do you want to say about Scott Rickards and water?
Well, it's absolutely one of the things that we track very closely in the resources section of the Crash Course book. It's going to define a huge portion of how the future unfolds, and in particular, you look at what's happening with the aquifers under key agricultural areas in the United States. The Ogallala aquifer is already so low that in parts of Kansas, they've just shut down farming, as it were. But this is happening all over the world. Saudi Arabia's got a problem. Pakistan's got a problem. It's a giant thing. People have been taking it for granted. It's absolutely going to be a wake-up call going into the future.
So once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki with the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking to two very, very smart people, Dr. Chris Martenson and Scott Rickards. We're talking about what's coming in the future. And like Chris was talking about in his book, Crash Course is going to come at us so fast. And as Kim and I have been preparing ever since reading Chris's book, The Crash Course, we have been diligently building a house and now going to court over water. Any comments, Kim?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons is, we were reading about water, too, and what's happening specifically like in California where there's a drought, and so they go to all the groundwater, like you're saying, Chris, the aquifers. They're digging all the water. The groundwater is now being depleted.
We have two very special guests, Chris Martenson. He's the author of The Crash Course, The Unsustainable Future of Our Economy, Energy and Environment, and I recommend everybody read that book because Chris talks about how fast this crash is going to hit us. We won't even see it coming. And the other guest is Scott Rickards. Scott Rickards is the president and CEO and the founder of Waterfront LLC, and he's talking about how water is going to be the most priceless commodity because water, as you know, affects everything. For example, food. And most people right now are realize there's a drought in California that's very severe. But it's not just rainwater that's not coming in. They've drained the aquifers. And the aquifers around the world, that's the groundwater, is depleted all over the world. Like I saw a picture of India in their agriculture growing region. Their groundwater is gone. And so that's going to affect all of us. Well, how's it going to affect me? It's going to affect you in the supermarkets because food needs water.
What did I hear that like to grow one almond, it takes like a gallon of water for one almond? I mean, the amount of water for agriculture.
Don't eat almonds.
I love almonds. Don't take my almonds away. But so if I can ask, okay, the water's getting more and more scarce. Where do we get water? Where do we get water if it's going to get so scarce and depleted?
That's the question California is asking themselves right now. and they haven't come up with any satisfactory answers yet. The answer has been actually to cut back on water. That doesn't help the farmers growing almonds, doesn't help America's food supply, it doesn't help the price of food anywhere in the world, and that's the crisis we're dealing with and California is dealing with. There are a lot of options. Desalination is one of them, transferring water from where there's plenty of it to the Central Valley of California. That's another solution. And these things just haven't been explored seriously by the state of California.
And desalinization is what?
Taking seawater, removing the salt through reverse osmosis, and producing fresh water.
And that's what Israel is doing right now. Is that correct?
Israel is the world leader in both that technology and implementing that technology, and it's what's used all over the Persian Gulf, for example. They rely 99% on that process.
So, but California decides they want to be bunny huggers and tree huggers.
Why are they not?
And they want to go to economy versus reality.
Is that why they're not embracing this?
It's marine life over human life, I think, in California. That's when you desalinate, you do release some salts back into the ocean, and that does kill fish, some fish, not many. And it's those fish that California is saving at the expense of their farmers and everyone else that relies on water in California.
Once again, we're talking to Scott Rickards this time. His website is worldswaterfund.com, and he's doing his best to create value out of water so that we don't waste it and we can sustain our lifestyle. And other guest is Chris Martenson. His website is peakprosperity.com. So, Chris, why don't you jump in, because this is all part of your book, right? The Crash Course?
Absolutely, and it speaks to this idea that we have a world population that's just growing and growing, which means people want more food. And a lot of that population is moving from relative poor standards into a more middle-class lifestyle, which means they're moving up the food curve. They want fresh foods. They want to eat more meat, things like that are actually very water-intensive. So when China's importing importing food, Kim, you had it. They're really importing water. I think a pound of wheat takes close to a ton of water to produce. And so when you watch the wheat being exported everywhere, it's really countries in many cases buying water. And I'm not as nearly as hopeful about reverse osmosis or this desalination as Scott is, because I look at the energy it takes to run those plants. It's a lot. I know that the Persian Gulf has a lot of desal plants running, but my question to them is, what are they going to do when, not if, but when their oil reserves run out, which they're basically pulling oil out.
So Scott, what do you think about that? The energy factor of water.
Well, listen, the question of peak oil is a separate one. In my view, what a great opportunity for Texas, right? And if that's the case, the price of oil is not where it should be today. If Chris is right, I'd be buying a lot of energy futures today. So that's one takeaway. But as far as desalination and how energy intensive it is, it improves all the time. And in fact, California hosted the largest gathering of desalination technology experts last week, and they turned. All these people turned away empty-handed because they realized that's not what California is going to do.
So politics beat reality.
That's right. Even though it's the most cost-efficient solution, it'll provide the most fresh water to California, and it'll solve the problem. They're not going to do it, and so that's the reality. But as for the oil and energy input into that technology, Chris is right. I mean, that's Persian Gulf can afford it, and the rest of us would have to pay for it.
So when we talk about
that's where understanding the value of water is very important.
So you talk about energy, and we talk about oil, and we talk about alternative energy. Is there such a thing as alternative water?
Well, that's really it. The other option, of course, is wastewater. Toilet to tap. That's what they call it in Singapore, where over 60% of the water now is recycled toilet water.
But that takes energy also, right?
And that also takes energy. It's expensive,
I hope so.
but it's less expensive than you might think, and that's the point of my work, is to show that these aren't impossible to achieve. It's not. It's far less than bottled water. It's probably 1/100th the price of bottled water to desalinate or to treat wastewater.
So today we're talking to Chris Martenson. He's the author of the Crash Course, and he's speaking about the unsustainable future of economy, energy, and environment. And Scott Rickards, he is the founder and CEO, president of Waterfund, and his website is worldswaterfund.com, and Chris's is peakprosperity.com. And we're talking about the future and how fast it's going to come. When Chris was speaking earlier, and again, if you missed it, please re-listen to this podcast, it's going to come upon us so fast we won't even know what hit us. And so that's why at Rich Dad, we're not trying to be pessimistic. We're just doing our best to be Paul Revere and warn people what is coming into the future. And as Kim and I talked about, we've bought our property with water rights from Grover Cleveland, and we have to defend them already, especially here in Arizona.
So Chris, a lot of people aren't going to go out and buy a house on the river. What do you do regarding water? What can I do?
Well,
what are you doing?
I live in a place where a lot of water comes out of the sky. I live in New England. It actually was one of the reasons I chose to settle here, and I would personally choose to settle in a place that has abundant water because I consider it just essential. But it's amazing how much people can do by saving water and starting to think of it as a valuable commodity and understanding that there's just so much you can do in terms of how you capture rainwater, if that's something you can legally do in your state, to storing it yourself, to just understanding that it's going to be more expensive, but it's the derivative of that people need to understand. If you want to eat fresh water, fresh foods, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, stuff like that, most of that comes from California. Most of that is grown in the desert. It's going to become more expensive. So one of the things I do is I have a garden and I support local farmers because I happen to think we're going to have to end up getting more of our fruits and vegetables close to home over time.
So and we also talked about Chile while we're during the break. Chile has all these glaciers, but when I looked at their glaciers are almost gone. And Chile and Peru are also deserts, and that's where we get a lot of our food from. Is that correct, Scott?
Absolutely, and it's one of the reasons you see some of the large sovereign wealth funds of the world, the Qataris, the Chinese, the Norwegians, actually buying not only land but glaciers, and that's an opportunity.
You can buy a glacier.
That's an opportunity that you don't have everywhere, but Chile actually allows private individuals to buy the runoff from glaciers. The only place in the world that allows you to do.
Interesting.
I also heard about people thinking about towing an iceberg down to California.
I think I'm probably too young to have been around when that was tried, but I think in the 70s that was someone tried to do that, and it didn't work very well.
So, Scott, the thing that really concerns me, it was Chris Martenson's partner, Adam Taggart, who made me aware of it, is a depletion of deep aquifers, groundwater. And, California is bright red, from the satellite images, means there's no groundwater left. So even if they got rain, the groundwater is gone. How serious, and the same as India and most like Kansas and all that, how serious a problem is the depletion of groundwater, even if rain does come?
It's the biggest problem facing anyone that relies on that source, and that includes the entire Middle East. It includes California, and a lot of what you're seeing, I would argue, in the Middle East in terms of violence, extremism, war, is the result of really a total lack of and exhaustion of groundwater. Southern Iraq used to be a swamp, and it's completely dry. And I actually know and have worked with investors who owned a lot of water assets all over the Middle East and have written down $500 million investments as a result of the fact that water's really dried up. The groundwater's dried up. And once that happens, there's no reversing course. I mean, there is something called aquifer recharge, but that's if you think desalination's hard, that's a lot more difficult.
So it's a serious problem.
Big time problem. Yeah.
So how do people invest in Waterfund, or do you take investors?
We invest in water assets. So we invest in projects that are producing water, in places like the Middle East, in places like California, and our product's called Blue Bond, and it's available at worldswaterfund.com.
So you do take, I mean, is there a minimum, or do you have to be accredited or investor? Or?
You have to be an accredited investor, but it's a relatively low minimum, and these are assets that normally you have to invest tens of millions of dollars to have access to. So that's one of the things we've done is taken those opportunities and opened them up, because the only other way to invest in water are publicly traded ETFs that own shares of Siemens and GE, and in my view, that's not a real pure play on water.
So just to be clear, Waterfund, we're not involved with Waterfund LLC. We don't endorse it. We're here for education. But you're saying listeners could invest in water via funds like yours, or otherwise it's a stock play. Is that correct?
That's right. You can. There are a few others. There's another company called Water Asset Management that's very good, that owns water assets all over the U.S. The only other option, unfortunately, are the public equity markets, which I'm not terribly interested in right now.
Amen. And Chris, how do people invest with you? And you have a new book coming out called Prosper, right? How to prepare for this coming demise.
Yeah, we think that there's a lot of ways that people can prosper in the future. Part of it starts with really broadening your sense of what you call wealth. People have been marketed to that wealth means money. It means stocks. It means bonds. We think it means many things besides that. And in Prosper, the new book coming out, it should be out in October, we talk about all the ways you can begin to trade financial capital for other forms of capital. Living capital is one. Water is an important example of living capital. Since you put some of your money into getting Grover Cleveland's grandfather's water, that's exactly an example of the kind of thing we outline in the new book.
So let me ask you, let's say I live in Manhattan, what's one thing I could do in Manhattan?
Oh, move.
I agree. So once again, I want to thank the two of you. Once again, we had Scott Rickards, who's president and CEO of the Water Fund. His website is worldswaterfund.com. And this is a very important program because we had two fantastic guests. Chris Martinson's been with us for years. He is a PhD, a researcher, and he studies this stuff. And also Scott Rickards, his father is Jim Rickards, author of The Currency Wars, and Scott is the president and CEO of Waterfund LLC. I hope by now all of you realize that water is going to be one of the biggest and best investments in the world, because as populations increase, the amount of water we consume increases with it. And right now there's no real way to track the real value of water, and that's what Scott Rickards is doing through Waterfund LLC. So once again, thank you to them. And Kim, any comments on our guests?
I just want to say, I hope people are realizing, too, that water is really one of the most precious resources. And we really need to make some changes, because as there are alternative energies to oil, there's solar, there's wind, there's water. And well, there's maybe not water anymore. There's no alternative to water. It's what it is what it is. So
once again, you can submit your questions to Ask Robert at richdadradio.com. So Melissa, what's the first question?
Our first question today comes from Christopher in North Carolina. Favorite book, Unfair Advantage. Says, what are your views on mobile home investing?
Well, it's like I say every time, what are my views on it? It doesn't make any difference. What are your views on it? Like I looked into it. Kim and I researched it. There's a book called Deals on Wheels. It's about the pros and cons of investing in mobile homes parks, and Kim and I looked at it.
We actually researched a couple mobile home places down in southern Arizona.
And it's not our bad cup of tea. But what I really encourage all of you to do is you've got to study what you want before you put your money. And most people are really effing stupid. They just turn their money over just because the deal sounds good. Just like Waterfund LLC from Scott Rickards sounds interesting, but now if I'm going to invest in it, I better start doing my own research into it. And I think the reason most people are broke is because they're lazy and they don't do their research, and they have a too small a picture. Mobile homes is like a drop on the ocean in the world of investing. So you've got to look at the big picture. North Carolina is a good state to invest in, but you also have to look what's going on in South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, what's happening in the economy, what's happening with movements, what's happening to housing costs, and where our population is moving to. North Carolina is a good place because populations are moving south as they move out of places like Chicago and the Northeast. But as Chris Martenson says, he's living up north now because he's close to water. So all of these things are factors. And so to ask me really what I call a pinhead question, as to what about mobile homes, I'm going, hey, you got to do your research. Don't ask me. If you're lazy, just ask a financial planner and they'll tell you what to do with your money. Give it to them. Any comments, Kim?
Well, I just remember early days when we were doing our when we were buying apartment buildings, and I still remember there was one building, and it was run like a hotel. So we were selling all the furniture. We had this big yard sale, and we were selling all the furniture. And the biggest buyer was this little old lady who owned this huge mobile home park in Phoenix, Arizona. And that's how she was funding her. So she would go and she'd buy all our furniture and put it in her mobile home. And her mobile home park was her retirement. That's what she and her husband were living off.
That was her plan.
So for them, it was a great plan. It worked for them. But as you're saying, Robert, you got to do your research. You got to figure out what your plan is.
And because it's not about, if you've heard our program, Rich Dad, before, it's not about the real estate. It's about the management of it and the financing and the structures and the whole thing. So I hate to bark at people, but I'm sick and tired of people asking me really simple little questions. I mean, I do this all day long. I sit there and listen to people going, pull your head out of your butt. I mean, you don't just turn your money over on no research and study. If you don't want to study, put it in mutual funds. Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Leon in Colombia. Favorite book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Says, I'm having trouble understanding the surge in the value of the U.S. dollar. If the Fed is printing trillions of dollars, common sense would lead someone to believe that the increase in supply would cause the value of the dollar to fall, not rise. Why is this happening?
Well, that's why you should read Scott Ricketts' father's book. His father was Jim Ricketts, one of the smartest guys I've ever met. Kim and I were with Jim down in Cancun recently. And to listen to Jim Ricketts talk is like trying to take information in through a fire hose. Man, that guy knows his stuff. He was part of LTCM, Long-Term Capital Management, which was a crash of the Russian ruble back in the 90s. So this is what I mean by study. I study this stuff. So I would, if you're interested in currency, the guy to study is Jim Ricketts. It's called Currency Wars. And Currency Wars is about how they're not having trade wars anymore. They're fighting with currency. So by China devaluing the yuan, it makes the U.S. dollar more valuable. So people rush out of the yuan and they rush into the dollar. But what that signifies is every BRICS country, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They supply resources to China. Their currency now gets weaker. So they're all running into the U.S. dollar. Now, the problem with that is the strong U.S. dollar is going to mean more poverty in the U.S. because if our dollar is strong, we can't export to the rest of the world. So a strong dollar is good news for people who operate internally in the U.S., but for those who are in manufacturing and do business overseas, this is a very serious problem. Also, that means the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they're going to have to pay their debt back in dollars, which means when the dollar goes up, their debt goes up and their currency goes down. So this is a very serious problem. I really recommend reading Scott Ricketts' father's book, Jim Ricketts, Currency Wars, because today we're in a currency war. So, Melissa, what's the next question? I trust you understand it, but currency is one of the most confusing subjects of all, and currency became an issue after 1971 when President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, and suddenly currency became this huge, it's called FX, foreign exchange. It becomes one of the faster of all markets in the world. I don't understand it. That's why I stay in real estate, because it's slow and stupid. Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Derek in Hawaii. Favorite book, Cashflow Quadrant. How does the China market crash affect the situation with the U.S. debt limit?
Well, it's a very serious problem. It's not that China is in trouble. It's to devalue the yuan or the renminbi, whatever they call it these days. And that's really the problem, because China making the renminbi weaker and it makes the dollar stronger means American dollars become more attractive. People move in here to invest in all this, so it looks good temporarily. But looking into the long-term future, it's not good for Americans, especially for the poor and middle-class Americans. A strong dollar is really going to affect them, especially, because they, rule number 1 in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, chapter 1, rule 1 is rich don't work for money. So if you're saving dollars, you look good today, but in the long term, it may be the biggest mistake you make.
And Chris Martenson said too, he said, right now we're not printing money. There's a lot of countries that are still printing money, but right now the U.S. isn't printing money, but he predicts that they're going to be printing a lot of money, and then that's going to change the whole game plan as well.
I beg to differ with Chris. They always print money. It's called the fractional reserve system. When you put $1 in the bank, banks print $10. So the whole system is based upon printing money. So that's why my book is called, Second Chance, and I recommend people read that, because it's all about currency or money and how the money system is manipulated, including the stock market. I mean, you're actually trusting your future to the stock market? You got to be crazy. I think the most important person right now is what Jim Rickards said. Again, it's Scott Rickards' father. He said that what's going to happen, there's a tug of war right now between inflation and deflation. And what he predicts and what Chris Martenson predicts and Scott predicts is there's going to be a crash, a major crash, and we're going to go into a next depression. Now, this is not true yet, but this is what the smartest guys are predicting. So we'll go into hyper deflation, like a depression. To save that, to try and pull us out of this mess, they're going to go to hyperinflation in the U.S. So that means everything will cost more and more and more. So that's why Kim and I are into gold, silver, guns, bullets, water, and places that are safe away from major cities. So we hate to be pessimistic, but the odds of a crash coming, which leads to a depression and then to hyperinflation, and that's what I cover in my book, Second Chance. There's a video called The Man Who Could Predict the Future. It's 60 minutes long. Please look at it. It's your education.